A room full.
All
So,
right.
welcome everyone. I am Liza Bernard from the Norwich Bookstore, but obviously hosting from home, actually from my daughter's bedroom. And while the bookstore is not open for browsing at the moment, we are happy to take orders by phone and email or via the web. And then we ship to you, or you can stop by and pick it up from the porch. Even if you're from Hanover, it's a contact-free arrangement. And I have to say, we've been told we've gotten really good at being your personal shopper. So we invite you to take us up on the offer to do some personal shopping for Valentine's Day or birthdays or whatever. So thank you for joining us tonight. And we're asking everyone to keep their video off and their audio mute so that they're not distracting to the speaker. And we recommend that you choose the speaker option on your tablet or computer, so that all the little blocks go away and you only get the speaker in the frame. And then we recommend that you turn on the chat button. On this computer, it's the bottom of the screen. And there you'll see links to the book eventually, and you can also add your questions and comments, and that's how we're going to do the Q&A. We will be recording this event to post to our website later. It usually takes about a week to process the video and get it posted. And that brings me to my thanks to Michael Prowls, who's the one whose email you'll see. He's working the back room to keep everything running smoothly. So when you see his email, or if you're messaging with him, that's what he's doing. So the format this evening, pretty basic. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we turn it over for the presentation. And then, as I mentioned, we invite you to share your questions in the chat towards the end of the program, or actually probably the middle of this program. And I'll jump in and share and moderate those questions. So our guest tonight is Charles Wheelan, who is a graduate of Dartmouth College. He earned his master's in public affairs from Princeton University and got a PhD in public policy from the University of Chicago. From the late 90s till the early 2002, actually till 2002, he was the Midwest correspondent for The Economist, and he's written freelance articles for lots of publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune. And he was the senior lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Charlie joined the Dartmouth faculty almost 10 years ago and is a senior lecturer and policy fellow, say that 3 times fast, at the Rockefeller Center. He teaches courses on education policy, healthcare, tax policy, income inequality, and other related topics. And among those courses is a practicum in global policy leadership, which in non-pandemic times includes travel all around the world: India, Turkey, Madagascar, Liberia, so far. So he's no stranger to travel, as you will learn in this book. His first book, published nearly 20 years ago, was Naked Economics: Undressing the Dismal Science. And it's an accessible and entertaining introduction to economics, and it's now published in 14 languages, which that's pretty impressive. In 2013, he followed that up with Naked Statistics: Stripping the Dread from the Data, which became, surprisingly, a New York Times bestseller, a book on statistics. Who knew? He's also the founder and co-chair of Unite America. I don't know, are you still doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's
we're not done yet. There's work to be done, but
exactly. It's an organization dedicated to bridging the partisan divide and electing a more representative and functional government. And he wrote the Centrist Manifesto along those lines, which was also published in 2013. And perhaps, as he mentioned, needed even more than ever today. His most recent nonfiction book, Naked Money: What It Is and Why It Matters, was published 4 or 5 years ago. But in the meantime, he published a novel, his first novel, called The Rationing, which is a prescient tale of pathogens, politics, and payments. And it was published in 2019. He actually presented it at a bookstore, which was fun. And it's available now in hardcover and coming in paperback in June. So without further ado, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Liza. And for the lovely introduction. The only thing it's missing is the Valley News. which will come up again because the Valley News actually played a very large part in the way that I was able to get into journalism and therefore writing. So I'm actually going to come back to that when I talk about what motivated us for this trip. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plunge into the book, then we'll back up and talk for a while about what motivated to write it. But the book does not begin at the beginning, which is why I think it works tonight to start here. The first chapter is called Lost in Medellin. And there's a little subhead below the chapter title called, and it says, could Katrina and CJ have been grabbed off a crowded metro train at rush hour? If so, how would I explain that to my mother, who is on the call tonight? So maybe she'll be able to weigh in on that. 2 of my children were missing. I was standing on a train platform in Medellin, barely 10 days into a trip that would, in theory, take our family around the world. It had been over an hour since Katrina, 18, and CJ, 13, had disappeared into the rush hour mayhem. Yes, Medellin, Colombia, the former seat of Pablo Escobar's drug empire, one of the most violent places on the planet in the 1980s and 90s. During that period, Colombia was a country where drug kingpins bribed compliant police officers and politicians and assassinated those who could not be bought. It was a country where the narcos corrupted the state from within, while guerrilla groups fought to overthrow the government, a simmering civil war that was funded by extortion, drug trafficking, and kidnapping, where children from wealthy families were snatched off school buses, taken deep into the jungle, and sometimes held for months until their families could scrape together the huge ransom. Where so many people were kidnapped during the height of the violence that Colombia's biggest radio station developed a program explicitly designed for kidnapped victims and their families. Beginning at midnight on Saturdays, the show offered Colombians an opportunity to call in and broadcast messages to kidnapped relatives. Yes, that Medellin. Of course, by the time I found myself on a train platform in the fall of 2016, Colombia had transformed itself. The government and the left-wing FARC rebels, the biggest guerrilla group, had negotiated a peace deal that would soon be put to a public referendum. Pablo Escobar was dead, violent crime had plummeted, but still, where were my children? We had been separated at rush hour when we could not all squeeze on the same train. That was now feeling like a long time ago. Why were Katrina and CJ not texting me? What could go wrong for 2 American kids wandering lost in Medellin? The rational part of my brain was saying, not much. I work with data. I wrote a book on statistics. The real dangers in life for young people in Medellin or New Hampshire are motor vehicles and smoking and suicide and sun exposure. Getting kidnapped in Medellin in 2016 was more like a shark attack, a relatively improbable event that captures an undue amount of public attention. But I watched Shark Week. I've read about people who were struck by lightning twice. Unlikely events are unlikely, but they are also events, which means they happen. As an hour drifted toward 90 minutes, and Katrina and CJ still had not turned up or texted, the rational part of my brain was losing out to the more imaginative side. I began thinking of the lottery slogan, someone's got to win, might as well be you. Only it was being twisted in my mind into some people still get kidnapped, maybe it was them. I was running out of alternative explanations for why 2 reasonably intelligent teens had not found a place with Wi-Fi from which they could contact my wife, Leah, or me. As I waited idly and ineffectually on a train platform, making sure not to lose my own Wi-Fi connection, various scenarios began worming their way into my mind. Could Katrina and CJ have been grabbed off a crowded metro train at rush hour? And if so, how would I explain that to my mother? So I'll pause there. Obviously, they were not kidnapped off the metro train, or you would have read about it in the Valley News, and we probably wouldn't be doing this book event. But it's worth talking about what happened, and then I'll talk for a little bit about why we thought that going around the world for 9 months would be a good idea beginning in Colombia. So we had set out that day to buy bus tickets. There were 5 of us. Interestingly, it wasn't the 5 in our nuclear family. We have 3 children who were on part of the trip. Katrina, who's the oldest, CJ, the youngest, both mentioned here. Sophie, who was still at home because she wanted to finish her volleyball season in Hanover, but we did have my niece Tess with us. So we actually had the kid's cousin who was not lost. She was with me. And at the time I was thinking, at least I did not lose someone else's child. the train came in. It was a lovely metro station, but it was super crowded. The first car came on. CJ had been kind of standing near the map of the entire system. Leah was closest to the car that came up, and Tess and I were in the middle. And I believe Leah got onto that car. And as she got onto the car, CJ yelled, "San Pedro." And then the doors closed. So the next car came, and Tess and I were on to squeeze on, and the doors closed, and CJ and Katrina got on the last train. So we're all on 3 different trains. And as we pull away, I look at the map to see where the San Pedro station is, because presumably that's why CJ yelled out San Pedro. We'll all get off there. And in the entire metro system of Colombia, there is no San Pedro station. So now we've got a bit of a dilemma. We do all have phones, but they can only use Wi-Fi. Only I believe, had a cellular plan. So the logical thing to do would be get off, get cell phone coverage, or sorry, Wi-Fi coverage, text each other and arrange a rendezvous. And that's what Leah and I and Tess did. So in a matter of minutes, we were all reconnected, and the time just goes by with Katrina and CJ not turning up, not turning up, not turning up. So I actually went to the head of security at the station and said, I said in my Spanish, I think I said, "I've lost my goats," but he was able to figure out what I was talking about. And he said, "How old are your children?" And I said, "Well, the oldest one's 18. And he looked at me with an expression that had a certain pathos to it, because it's hard to lose a healthy bodied 18-year-old. So he responded, "Well, just call her." So he wasn't very concerned, which made me less concerned. But eventually about 90 minutes went by, and eventually we got a text from Katrina and CJ. And here's what had happened. In some ways, this expresses the challenges of traveling with teenagers. It's not that Colombia is a terribly dangerous place. One has to be careful. But what happened was CJ had yelled San Pedro for no reason at all. He's 13. He was near the map. We thought that what he yelled was informed by the map. It wasn't. So we all operate on this assumption that San Pedro is where we should go. He just to say, even after the fact, he couldn't really explain why he yelled San Pedro. That sets in motion this belief we should all go to San Pedro. Now, here's the amazing part. Once it's clear there's no San Pedro, CJ and Katrina decide they're going to go to San Pedro. Now, again, he's the one who knows there's no reason behind it, but they do find a San Pedro bus stop that is on some distance spoke. So they get off at the metro station closest to San Pedro bus stop and begin walking, soon realizing it's a fool's errand. They don't have any money for a taxi. They walk back. In the end, CJ had a little pedometer on his phone, and it showed that they had walked 10 miles. And so this combination of 13-year-old idiocy, just yelling San Pedro, and 18-year-old obstinacy, well, if we said San Pedro, we got to go to San Pedro, led them to kind of walk 10 miles. And I think one of the big takeaways, first of all, that was only 10 days in the trip. We were really rusty. We just made lots of mistakes that we would not make again. We would never split up on a train like that. We would talk about in advance where we were going. We would make sure everybody had money. So if you needed a taxi, you could find a taxi. We would all be quicker to find Wi-Fi. So part of it, we just had to get our travel legs under it. But the funny thing is, when we went to dinner that night, everybody was in a great mood. I mean, there was a minor argument between me and Katrina over, I made some reference to how they'd been lost, and she just ripped into me and saying that she'd never been lost. At every point, she knew exactly where she was. And the definition of being lost is where you don't know where you are. I said, all right, then I didn't know where you were. You weren't lost. But other than that, everybody was in a great mood. And we kind of had this lovely Mexican dinner, decided that we really enjoyed Medellin. And on the whole, the day was a lot of fun. So it was a sense to us that this crazy adventure might just work, and that we had, if we stuck with it, the resiliency to make it through some of the bumps. And this became a source of inspiration as we pressed on. But let me back up and just talk about, what led us to be in Medellin in the first place. This was the fall of 2016. Leah, my wife, and I had talked for a long time about doing some kind of trip like this with the family. One important piece of history is that we had done something similar, just the two of us, when we graduated from Dartmouth in 1988. We paid for it ourselves. spent the summer and the fall working. Leah went to Nantucket and worked at one of the country clubs there, lived in kind of the barracks behind the pro shop. I went home, caddied on the weekends, worked at a law firm during the week. And when we had enough cash, which was about October, and really it was about the same price as a Honda Civic in terms of our plan for a 9-month journey around the world, we took off. And that turned out to be fall of 1988, spring of 1989. Well, if you think back, 88, 89 was a pretty remarkable time to be traveling the world. And as I alluded to earlier, I had gone to the Valley News and said, if I send you articles, can I be like your roving foreign correspondent? Remember, this is all pre-internet, and certainly the Valley News doesn't have correspondence of its own. So they graciously said yes. And a shout out to Dan Mackey, whose column you may read in the Valley News. I think he's officially retired, but he was the guy who edited my articles back in '89. Somebody else started out at first and then handed it off to him. Well, it turned out that we saw some remarkable things. We were in China in 1989, not in Beijing, but we were in Lhasa, Tibet, when the Chinese government cracked down on the Tibetans quite brutally. It was a remarkable foresight of what was about to happen a few months later in Tiananmen Square. So I've certainly never before and never since been standing in a lobby of a hotel watching tanks go by. The journalists who were staying in the room on the hallway with us were arrested by the Chinese government. They just disappeared, came back several days later, telling stories about how they've been treated. So for people who were 22 or 23, it was just a remarkable life experience. We got into Europe, 1989 should ring a bell. Again, we weren't there. The wall didn't come down to the fall, but the cracks were in the wall. So for example, we were in Hungary when they allowed there was a fence between Hungary and Austria, and they allowed the first people to pass from Hungary into Austria. Now, the irony of the time is that the folks in Hungary had no hard currency, so they could walk into Austria, but they had no money to spend. So people would like walk to Austria for the day, walk around, and then go back home. More significantly, we saw the relaxation of the ban on books that had been in place since World War II. So little merchants would come out and they would sell the books that had been banned during the communist regime, Animal Farm, 1984, all of those kinds of things. So for us, it had been a formative experience. I was able to write for the Valley News, which then became an important career move in that I had clips that I could show to other journalism outlets. It was a wonderful way to explore the world. It was much cheaper than people thought. As parents, we thought, why not try to do that with our kids? We kind of looked at the timing. We figured we had one shot at it. We had a couple rules. We didn't want to do it when the kids were really young, both for career reasons and the health issues become a little more serious. They have less resiliency and so on. We didn't want any of the children to have to miss the first year of high school or the senior year of high school. And that, nor once they went off to college did we think they'd be interested. So it kind of came down to this 2016, 2017 window. And once we negotiated with Sophie that she could do her 2 months of volleyball season and then join us in Peru, we kind of had everybody on board. I will point out again that just because it's not obvious, that it was much, much cheaper than staying at home. And it's not just because we shop at the co-op and it can be a bit pricey. It's that we rented out our house and therefore that became our housing budget. It is much cheaper to buy street food and to shop locally. Airbnb is a very affordable option, so our housing budget went relatively far. There's no clothing purchases. The automobiles go in storage. The insurance goes away. Most of my, luxury, all my golf expenses go away. And, so really, it literally was cheaper than going away. And of course, the big cost is foregone income. So really it was 9 months of income that we gave up. And we were extremely privileged to have jobs that we could come back to when we were done traveling. That's the real lucky part. And just for the policy wonks out there, you give up 9 months of income, but you would have had to pay taxes on it anyway. So you depending on your tax bracket, you're really only giving up like 60% of 9 months income. So not that everybody can do it, but it's not that you have to win the Powerball to make it happen. It was more about just resolve. And I think the last thing before I read another section is a big part of it was that the kids were totally game for this. We had, as Liza said in the introduction, we had been traveling together to some pretty crazy places for a long time, in part because at the University of Chicago and then at Dartmouth, I taught this class where we study places and then go there at the end of the term. So for 10 weeks on campus, you immerse yourself in Rwanda or Madagascar, and then you get on a plane with the students and fly there. And the first time we went, CJ was so young that he stayed with my parents. We went to India. I think he was maybe 18 months. The girls were 6 and 4 or something like that. The next year he joined us. So I had 12 graduate students, Leah, who graciously came along to help out, obviously, and then kids who were like 6, 4, and 3, or whatever, they were 7, 5, and 3. So I'm simultaneously trying to teach grad students and give timeouts at the same time on the bus. But that does mean that the kids were just used to traveling in some crazy places. I think CJ met his first dictator when he was about 7. We had, through strange reasons, we had gone to Madagascar, which was run by an oligarchy at the time, and they had instated this disc jockey who was effectively a despot. The United States had withdrawn our ambassador in protest. We were able to arrange a meeting with the dictator. I had to go to the embassy, the staff who were there, and say, is this okay? They said it would be fine because it was an educational mission, but ask about these political prisoners. I did not decide to do that. But the thing about the dictator is that he had, like all great dictators, put pictures of himself all around the country. You really couldn't use a bathroom stall without a picture of the dictator looking at you. But those pictures, it turned out, were heavily airbrushed. So we walked into the chamber where the dictator, just like in the movies, was sitting at a table that was raised above us on this embarrassingly large throne with an airbrushed portrait above his head that had to be like 12 feet high. And CJ walks in, and again, he's 6 or 7. He doesn't have much filter to this day. He had even less filter then. And he looked, and I can see it happening in slow motion. He looks at the dictator, and then he looks up at the picture, which does not look like the dictator. It's this beautiful airbrushed portrait, and staring in front of us on this giant throne is a guy with, not very attractive, lots of pock marks. He just doesn't look like the airbrush. And CJ's like, and he just blurts out, he's so much uglier than his portrait. And I mean, I think they could hear it like 2 towns over. Fortunately, the dictator's, his English was extremely poor, and we had to translate from French. But we later on told CJ that maybe he needed to dial it down in countries where you could be incarcerated for no obvious reason. And the others were used to it as well. When I finally took Katrina to Washington, D.C. in middle school, we went to the Hyatt or something like that. She came running out of the Hyatt bathroom and said, Dad, can I drink the water here? Because she was so conditioned to everywhere, every time she was in a hotel, you can't drink the water. That was just how she associated. So they were really game. And we did kind of a trial run in spring break of 2014. We decided to go to Albania for spring break, which is not really a common spring break destination, but we figured, if we can make Albania work, we can make anything work. And it turned out we just had a complete blast. We had a car that got lost deep in the Albanian countryside, ended up bottoming out in a road that wasn't really meant for car travel. Enjoyed lots of fun meals. Realized that Albania was not a traditional country, but we would have fun as a family anyway. And that was, to us, I think, a green flag that this was all going to work. So let me read one other section. There's kind of a few. This is the Indian bureaucracy. And to put this in context, we needed to get a multi-entry Indian visa. And that became necessary. This is a more serious part because Katrina, when we were in the Amazon, wasn't diagnosed till later, but had been bit by a sandfly. And she had contracted leishmaniasis. We hadn't yet diagnosed it, but we knew that she had an ulcer on top of her foot that was not healing. And eventually, mostly through my mother who's on the call, we sent a photo who was looked at by her dermatologist, who diagnosed it as a disease that, if left untreated, is quite serious. And so once we realized that it was leishmaniasis, we needed to get somewhere where there was treatment. And it turned out that the College of Tropical Medicine in Calcutta was a place with a specialty in leishmaniasis. So it was quite urgent that we get a multi-entry visa because we would have to come back to India a couple of other times. And if we couldn't get it for at least Katrina and I, then we might not be able to get to the College of Medicine for treatment. So this is the beginning of our effort to get the multi-entry visa. This chapter is called Indian Bureaucracy 2, Wheelan Family 1. The visa section of the Indian Embassy in Yangon, Myanmar is open every weekday from 9:30 to 11:30 a.m. So since we're traveling, we have to go to an embassy in another country, obviously, to get the visa. We happen to be in Myanmar. Katrina and I arrived at 10:50. It was open until 11, figuring we could pick up the forms and then return the next day with our documents in order. The first visit would be a reconnaissance mission. What we fail to realize is even reconnaissance planes get shot down from time to time. Poised just inside the entrance of the visa section was a gatekeeper in the literal sense of the word, an Indian woman whose sole job consisted of letting people in or out, but mostly keeping them out. The woman pointed to the sign on the door saying the office was closed. I pointed vigorously to the sign next to the door, indicating that the visa section was open till 11, and then to my watch, which showed that it was 10:51. As I was gesticulating on the stoop, a man arrived carrying some forms and a stack of crisp American bills. The woman let him in. As she went to close the door, I stuck my foot in it. There were more pantomimes on both sides, with my foot literally still wedged in the door. I explained that if I could get the forms and ask one simple question, a 90-second undertaking, then we would be prepared to return the next day with everything in order. At that point, a sanctimonious European gentleman, now there's an asterisk in my journal, I did not call him that. I called him a sanctimonious part of the human anatomy, but for the purposes of the book, he's a European gentleman, told me that I was being rude. He was technically correct, but his criticism would have carried more weight if he were not already standing inside, looking at me over the shoulder of the gatekeeper. It was like someone sitting in a lifeboat reprimanding me for splashing and yelling as I tried to climb in. I did not get the rest of my body inside the door before 11. Katrina and I returned to the hotel and downloaded the requisite forms. The next day, we returned to the embassy well before the posted opening time of 9:30. When the office opened, nasty woman in a sari was once again standing guard. We watched in horror as she slammed the door on an elderly Japanese man who was there for his 5th visit. As I looked around at the other supplicants in line, I began to have a bad feeling. Everyone else had electronically uploaded their photos to the visa form. Our photos were attached with a paperclip. The instructions online had said that uploading the photos was optional. After an hour and 15 minutes of waiting outside in brutal heat, we were admitted to the promised land, the air-conditioned antechamber of the visa section. In an adjacent room, the clerks distributing visas were standing behind windows like bank tellers. A male official asked to see our paperwork. I presented him the forms and the required cash. He shook his head disapprovingly. The photos must be uploaded to the form, he said. Also, these dollar bills are not acceptable. Each visa cost $102. All of the bills, including the singles, had to be crisp and not issued before the year 2013. Our $100 bills were fine, but the singles were too wrinkled. It was now 10:40. Katrina and I rushed outside to find a business center with good enough internet to upload our photos, and then to a money changer who would give us 4 crisp American dollar bills. We wandered for 10 minutes and found neither. We can run around in the heat, I said, but that's just confusing motion for action. We'll never make it back by 11. We're going to give up, Katrina said. We didn't give up when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor, I answered, a sarcastic reference to the famous Animal House scene. What are you talking about? She asked. Apparently, she's never seen the movie. Eventually, 11 o'clock arrived and the argument became irrelevant. So what eventually happened, and you remember, this is in our minds, this is quite serious because we got to get to Calcutta for treatment. We decide that we're never going to make it. And so we ended up taking a bus for 10 hours to the consulate in Mandalay because CJ pointed out it had better ratings on TripAdvisor. Who knew that you can rate a consulate on TripAdvisor? So at the end of the 10-hour ride, We eventually made it to Mandalay. We gave our stuff. Um, we went back to pick up the visas a few days later. And in kind of the final twist, the man said, the visas are fine. Everything's been approved. Remember, we've been in this battle with the Indian bureaucracy for a long, long time. He says, all we need is your fingerprints. One print from each hand. We just need 10 fingerprints. At which point we just blanched because Katrina only has 9 fingers. So she lost a finger when she was a child in a car accident. And so we go, and the computer's like, it's flashing, need 10 fingers, need 10 fingers. And we're thinking we've made it, we've taken a 10-hour bus ride to Mandalay, and the bureaucracy is playing its final hand. But this kind gentleman, unlike the woman in the sari, said, you know what, we'll just do it anyway. He kind of overrode the machine, gave us the visa, and we had it. The postscript here, we can talk more about the leishmaniasis, is Katrina ended up being treated in Germany, so we didn't need the visas anyway. But at the time, it felt quite important to us. So I will stop there. There are lots of other adventures, but we can turn it over to Q&A. And if there's any, if there are other parts of the book that are relevant to Q&A, maybe I'll read again. But I would be happy to answer any questions about why we did it, what went right, what went wrong, the family dynamics, which are a big part of the book, and anything else people want to talk about.
I had to unmute myself. So thank you. This is definitely a little taste of what the book is about. The book is fabulous. It's got serious, it's got funny. My question is, how did you keep track of it? Are you a journaler? Did you keep ongoing notes, computer, notebooks? What's your process for that?
I have kept a journal since I was 17. There's just volumes and volumes of uninteresting aspects of every element of my life. But I did take a journal on the trip. And that was significant for 2 reasons. One, obviously, those notes were the core of the book. I will say, in things that were not in the journal, one of the lessons we learned is how undependable human memory is. So I would have some records of a day, and then I would flesh that story out the way I remembered it, and then I would bounce it off the family, and they would say, no, we did that afterwards, or that was a different city. So it was great that we had notes to start with, but everything after that, it's a little dispiriting, actually, how your mind can play tricks on you. Now, the journal had another element too, which is I'm quite introverted. Katrina's quite introverted. Leah's kind of in the middle. Sophie hadn't joined us in the early parts of the trip, but she's more extroverted. And CJ is just a raging extrovert. And so one of the things, there's a technical term in the book called the complete family meltdown, which is when 3 people are crying at once, or 1 adult and 1 child crying at the same time. And the first complete family meltdown was driven by this introvert extrovert divide. And the reason I mention that in this context is, for me, going off in the morning writing my journal was a way to deal with my inner introvert, to kind of process thoughts and so on. Now, it turns out that CJ likes to process his thoughts in the moment out loud. So whereas I may take in a scene and write about an hour later, she's like, is that a goat? Hey, what do you think about goats? How come they do have goats in Vermont? Why are baby goats so much good? And when you're taking an 18-hour bus ride, that gets a little old. So our first complete family meltdown, the proximate cause was a canister of Pringles, but that was kind of like Archduke Ferdinand's assassination. The tinder had been set for a long time, and really it was about the introverts and the extroverts figuring out how we're going to travel together in close quarters. Probably, I would imagine, like people have been dealing with during COVID, where you're in close quarters. And the journal, and Katrina began keeping a journal, and maybe she'd already kept a journal. She developed a habit, though, of going away and spending time. So the introverts would go off and write, and the extroverts would be happy that we weren't around, because then they could make noise, and we would be happy that we had our solitude. So I would say that was one of the more important routines that we had to develop as we traveled.
So what there's lots of questions coming in. What was the opposite of the family meltdown? What was like the funniest or the highest point of the trip?
I described them as when the random mood generators all fired in the same direction. I mean, there were so many. One of them, like I said, was that night in Medellin, where maybe because we're all amped on endorphins, we're like, hey, we can do this. It was really cool. I mean, there were some, I'll give you one that was quite poignant. we stayed in Dar es Salaam in an Airbnb. And one of the wonderful things about Airbnb, and I hope this doesn't change, is that in most other parts of the world, this is usually kind of one unit that a family owns, or somebody who's got a good job. It's where they're storing cash in a safe way. And then usually they will put a family member or somebody else in charge to look after. So you get to meet somebody's 84-year-old father, their 17-year-old cousin. And they're very proud of the unit. So it was always a really nice way to engage with people. In Dar es Salaam, the woman who was looking after the unit was named Janet, and she was about our age, and she was quite chatty. She came to show us around, and she said, "Do you like children?" And we said, "Of course we like children." So she said, "Well, would you like to see a special school that I'm involved with?" And we said, "That would be fantastic." She said, "All right, I'll send my driver tomorrow and we'll go there." And that was kind of all we knew. She said, "It's a little hard. So, are you emotionally prepared?" And we said, "Yes, we're ready." So the next day, the driver came and he took us to a school that was for profoundly disabled children. So, probably nothing you would even see in the United States. So children with no legs who, would be either on scooters. Leprosy is considered bad luck in parts of Africa. So there were families of lepers, other children who had various disabilities. And so obviously we were a source of curiosity, and Janet wasn't there. So we just talked to the kids for a while. They were very curious about us. We were curious about them. And then the driver came back and said, "We're all going to Janet's house, including the kids." So about 10 kids, and we load up in the van, and we drive to this modest but beautiful home on the Indian Ocean. And the kids get out and they're wildly familiar with this place. And again, because of the disability, some kids are being carried, some kids are setting up wheelchairs, some kids are literally dragging themselves into the house. And we spend the day with Janet. And what we learn is that this is all a volunteer endeavor for her. The kids come to her house the weekend, she supports their schooling, that she's made it her life work to literally gather children who have been discarded by their family. So there is no meaningful social safety net. These are kids that she found on the side of the road, often begging because they've been kicked out by their families who consider them bad luck or unaffordable, what have you. So these are Janet's kids. And so I think it was beautiful to see our kids interact, because they just spent the whole day swimming and on the trampoline and taking videos of themselves. And I was proud of my kids that they could interact in a way that respected the dignity of the kids and had just had fun. And I was just awestruck by what Janet had done. I mean, it made me feel very small. And that was all just because she was our Airbnb host and she asked if we like kids. It was one of those where you never on God's earth would you think that this kind of opportunity would present itself. So that would be one. I mean, there are others that are more trivial. Near the end, Katrina had been treated successfully for the leishmaniasis in Germany with the assistance of Cotty Madden. So for those of you in Hanover know that Cotty graduated with Katrina in the class of 16 from Hanover High. Cotty was in Munich. She was like the superhero. She figured out where Katrina could get treated, looked after her in Munich. So then Cotty returned and traveled with Katrina and joined us in the Republic of Georgia. So we now had another person. And since Cotty was the hero, we decided that we would make her an honorary Wheelan. And for those of you who are old enough and you remember that scene in Diner, the film, where in order to get married, this woman has to pass a test, I think about the Baltimore Colts or something. We gave Cotty a test about Wheelan family history. What was the family business? It was undertaking. How big was Katrina? It was CJ when he was born, 11 pounds, And because Cotty had spent so much time with Katrina, she got enough right to pass. And so there was something beautiful about having Katrina's illness be treated successfully, having Cotty join us, being in the Republic of Georgia, which was great fun, and just having this really enjoyable night where we do the honorary Wheelan family quiz. So, and there were a lot of those kind of spontaneously beautiful moments.
So I know you spent a lot of time planning the trip, but then you also built in time for serendipities like meeting these children. How did you balance the planning ahead and the and leaving space for the joy of traveling?
We had a lot of flexibility built in. The way I would say it is we had kind of a hard exoskeleton with some spots, it's kind of pins in the map, some dates where we had to be in a certain place,
Mm.
and then long stretches, sometimes months between them. So for example, we knew we had to be back in June because I had to teach. More specifically, we knew Sophie had to take the SATs on June 3rd. So we had to be back in Hanover for that. We knew we were going to leave in September. My brother made plans to meet us with his family in the Galapagos for Thanksgiving. So boom, that was a pin in the map. We had tickets, one of the few sets of tickets that we bought ahead to fly from Quito to Christchurch, New Zealand. So that kind of got us across the Pacific. That was a day where we had to be there. There's some folks who had loaned us a home in Tasmania for a week. So that was a point. So they're just, we had some rented huts in New Zealand. So, but those were few and far between. So we kind of would wake up in a place like we landed in Cartagena in early September, and we really had nothing on the map for another 3.5 months. And the question was, okay, we're in South America now. What are we going to do? And I have to acknowledge Leah in the book. The New York Times gave a special shout out to Leah for her planning abilities. We went kind of with the benevolent despot model, which is to say that Leah's the best planner and enjoys it the most. She's a high school principal now, so she's well suited for what she does. When I'm in charge of planning things, we often show up on the wrong day. So she was very good at gauging what we wanted to do. She was also in charge of the budget, so she knew what we could spend, and she'd kind of canvass the group, and then she'd make a plan. She'd say, okay, we're going to go south to Peru, and we're going to cut over through the salt flats, and we're going to go this. And we kind of say, sounds good. And then we would do that. And of course, if we complained, she'd say, all right, do you want to plan it? And we'd say, absolutely not. And then we'd be back to being more acquiescent. So it was this combination of pins in the map with lots and lots of flexibility day by day built in between.
And did you split up or stay as the group?
Leah and I and CJ never split up, but the rest of the group was always coming and going. So we had our niece Tess with us for the first 3 weeks by design. She was in a Spanish immersion school. Her parents asked if she could join us. We said yes after a fair bit of deliberation. Tess, if you read the book, Tess was with us for one of the more hair-raising adventures in the Amazon when we stayed with an adventure lodge owner who has a sense of risk reward that's like 9 standard deviations above the normal. He just, if there's not a risk of dying, it doesn't much move the dial for him. So he took us on in this cave that went 9 levels underground. And we just slowly kind of wound our way deeper and deeper underground to a river. He's like, yeah, now you take your clothes off and swim. So we swam through this river 9 levels underground, and my niece was with us, but obviously that worked out okay. Sophie joined us in Lima as planned. Tess went home. Katrina, being the oldest and most independent, traveled on multiple occasions either by herself or with friends from Hanover High. Kati was one of them. She met some friends in Santiago, Chile. Bevan McDevitt joined her in Australia. So it was wonderful for her to have visitors along the way. And like I said, Sophie also had friends. Isabel joined us for a while, Isabel Loftus, but they never really went off on their own. She just joined us in progress. But yeah, it was a project in motion.
Was there a favorite country or a place that you all want to go back to?
So Colombia was, the Medellin experience notwithstanding, was absolutely a place that we wanted to go back to. The physical beauty, the charm of the people, the sense, it was a unique time because the peace agreement was negotiated, and actually the referendum on the peace agreement would take place just a couple weeks after we left the country. So there's a sense that had been the longest running civil war in the hemisphere, 50 years of guerrilla warfare that had taken a toll. For those of you who watched Narcos, and it was not exaggerated when you talk to people. So there's a sense that they kind of wrestled their country back from a dark place. And there was this collective sense of pride, and that we were there fairly early after, a sense of joy that we had kind of come to share it. I'll give you one story that expresses it. We got to Salento, which is this little coffee town, absolutely beautiful, nestled in the Andes, but we'd taken a really long bus ride. We got off the bus in the town square. We had a reservation to stay at a little bed Airbnb or bed and breakfast, but it was not in the center of town. All we knew was that it was near a yellow bridge. It was getting dark. The troops were restless. So we decided we would go eat before we found the place. So we went to this kind of open air restaurant that was lovely. We had a meal. The group mood indicator went up. And then we asked our waiter, we said, we kind of described where we were going. Is there any idea, anyone around here know where this is? So he scurried away and he came back with the owner of the restaurant. And the owner said, I will take you there. And we said, well, where is there? And he's like, I don't know, but we're going to find it. And the next thing we knew, we're in a restaurant, like imagine you're in Lou's and this car drives through the dining room. And apparently there was an egress big enough for a car. And he kind of weaves through the tables and he says, put all your things in the car. So, we compliantly put all our luggage in the back, and it's a sedan, but there are five of us. So we kind of all crowd in the sedan. We drive off into the darkness. So now we're driving into the darkness with a random guy in a car, but he's just so excited to find us. And we do eventually do see remarkably a yellow bridge, and we turn, and then it's completely dark. We get out with our iPhones and we're all searching using the flashlight function. We see this little sign for the name of our Airbnb. And so we followed it up, and he waved goodbye and off he drove. And it was just in many ways that I think was emblematic of the experience we had in Colombia. I've already gone back because I took students back there in 2018, and we actually went back to that same restaurant. So Colombia would be one, just because our expectations, I think, were so cautious. And the Republic of Georgia would be another. And it turns out that's the last place we went. Part of that was because Katrina rejoined us, but also it was just the quirkiest place. If I dropped you on the streets of Tbilisi and said, where are you? You'd look around and you'd say, well, it looks a little European, but this is not Europe. And there's something Russian going on, but I don't think I'm in Russia. And there's definitely a Turkish influence, but not enough to be Turkish. And the answer is you're in the Republic of Georgia, where all of those civilizations have washed over the place for 1,000 years. And the result is just remarkable food, really interesting history and archaeology. And we had a lot of fun there, especially having been reunited.
Wow, such an adventure. So a couple of questions about the book itself. So for those of you who haven't seen it, it's bright yellow with a bright blue bus. And it does have a section of photographs, basically mostly taken by the family. And you really get a sense of some of the highs and a few of the lows. And there are maps, and it's very clearly a travel adventure and a family story both. But I have a question about the redaction sections.
Yes.
I need to hear about them.
Well, first we have to give the backstory. So we rented our house. I didn't say who we rented our house to. So we left in June. In December of that year, which is of course too early to rent anything. The rental market doesn't usually work that far in advance. We mentioned over the holidays to my brother-in-law and his wife and their family that we'd be good taking this trip. And after a few bottles of wine, they said, maybe we should shake things up. Maybe we should move to Hanover for the year. So what turns out happening is that Leah's brother and his family moved to Hanover. Some of you so Claire Yagian, who ends up staying for a couple of years, came with them. Many of you may have worked with or known Jeff and Noel while they're here. So they came here for 9 months. But remember, we left in September, and I was watching a golf tournament in July when they arrived. There are 5 of them and a dog, and our house is not big. And I probably had not fully listened to all the details, but so there was a full, I don't know, what, a 2.5 month period or something between when they arrived in our house and when we left. And so the redacted portions were just kind of a comical effect. I had to just kind of describe what it was like to be under this roof with 10 people and 3 dogs, 2 of the dogs not getting along. It was not good, shall we say. And so all the redacted things are fake, but the conceit of it is that I would run the chapter by Leah so that I wouldn't say anything offensive to the family before it was published. And that, of course, leads to, I'm like, here's what really happened. Here's what I'm feeling. And then it'd be all redacted. And then my mother-in-law did come to visit. So that led to like 2 more redacted paragraphs. So it was just it was a comedic tool to express the reality, which is like, this was too many people in one house, without having any hurt feelings.
Did your family actually get to edit and approve of or disapprove
They
of?
did approve. Actually, there was only one person, I think, who needed to like legal approval, because the legal department, the publisher, reads this with a close eye.
Oh,
And her first reaction was, oh no, there were two people. Um, Only two people need to sign releases. So the first thing she said is, well, you don't need a release from CJ because he's a minor, but is he really okay with all this? And so, and of course, the nature of CJ's extroversion is he's of the mind, hey, if they're writing about me, that's great. Doesn't matter what it is. So he actually just adores all what was the heaping abuse that the rest of us put on him, including the chapter about him thinking that his penis was going to explode. And you got to buy the book to read that one. Um, the second person, or the first person who really did need to sign a legal release was Katrina, because on one of our long road trips, before I'd even begun writing the book, she threatened from the back seat. She said, I'm going to sue you. I'm going to sue you for libel. If you write about this, I'm going to sue you. And this is, of course, an 18-year-old arguing with her parents. And I just thought this was funny that she was suing for libel before anything had been written, which one would think would weaken your case. And so I put it in the book. It's kind of my last laugh. Like, isn't it funny that Katrina was going to sue me for libel? And then my editor called. He's like, now that she's expressed an intent to sue, we're going to need a statement from her. So she had the last laugh, and she graciously signed her release, and actually later complained or lamented that she felt she was treated too well, that she came off like too much of a goody two shoes. And I think she wanted to be a little more badass, but that was not Katrina. And then the couple in the Amazon, who were just like I said, his risk profile was crazy. I mean, we were lost in the jungle. There were two search parties looking after us. There were poisonous snakes. There were bullet ants. And then that chapter kind of ends like every night. Leah and I would go to bed and like, okay, that was fun, but we're still alive. Nobody can die. And to give you a sense, the first night we met with this guy and his wife, he said, make sure everyone wears their life jacket because one of the guests didn't come up last time. And he kind of mumbled it. And Leah and I got back to the hotel and we're like, what I heard him say was that someone went down and didn't come up. And we later probed it, like someone had drowned on the river to the lodge. And then we inspected the number of people who've gone on the trip. And it's a very, very small lodge. And that meant like 5% of the guests had died. And so we're like, okay, we're wearing our life jackets, but we're going to be really, really safe. Well, it just, for reasons you have to read about it, we would set out on a safe adventure and then it would turn out to be like 9 levels underground. He didn't tell us we were going 9 levels underground. He asked us if we wanted to do a short hike. Be like asking if someone you want to hike Guile in Norwich. Next thing you know, you're swimming without your clothes on 9 levels underground. So the last day he was trying to get us to go kayaking on this river that's a tributary of the Amazon. It's running fast. There are rocks everywhere. And we're like, God, no. And Leah's kicking me under the table. Like, we're not going kayaking. So we say a group. And by the way, they're lovely people. The food was great. So the chapter describes all that. And the lawyer's like, yeah, you're going to need to get them to sign off. So I send the manuscript to Kevin and Maria in Peru. And Kevin reads it. And he comes back. He's like, I love it. It's all true. And you really should have gone kayaking. That was his assessment of the chapter. So I actually got an email from him today because I'm going to send him a copy of the finished book. So that was the extent of the legal scrutiny.
Huh. Interesting. So any final words about the adventure of traveling with family?
I think most of the adventure is in raising teenagers. I think that's really hard wherever you happen to be. I mean, you can throw on some added layers when they're really hungry. It gets a little worse. But it also means you've got some shared experiences that make it a little better. So the book is really about parenting teenagers and being in close proximity to your family, which I think for a lot of people right now is very familiar. There's a whole bunch in here on homeschooling Sophie, because she's a junior. She had to do this VLAX program at Hanover High, or she was not going to advance to be a senior. And that was just hellacious. And of course, I think that now approximates the online learning experience that many people have had around the country. Thankfully, locally, we're back in school here. So I don't think we anticipated. We knew that the teenage part would resonate. I don't think we ever expected that the close proximity and the challenges of online schooling would have the resonance that they do.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting. Well, we do look forward to post-pandemic adventures and travel.
I feel like the timing is good, that we can start to dream again.
Yeah.
If not travel, we can at least start Googling fun places.
Yeah, well, definitely reading this book. You leave this country behind when you're reading. We came, we saw, we left. That's for sure. So I think this is a good place to wrap it up. I really appreciate your presentation tonight. And I didn't ask though. So when you were traveling on this trip, you finished the rationing. So, because I remember you saying that when you were in the store with the novel. What are you working on now?
So now I actually just finished a manuscript on writing, but I've got another novel that I want to write. It's another kind of political thriller about an attempt by a rich billionaire. It's redundant, but by a super rich man to use his wealth to create a permanent democratic big D party majority. And all I'll say is it doesn't work out like he plans.
Well, hopefully it's not as prescient as the rationing was. That was a little scary. So, okay, we look forward to when those books come out, and we'll get you back again, hopefully in person, maybe in person and online. And thank everybody for joining us tonight. And we do have events every Thursday for the next 3 weeks. John Morton's going to talk about Olympic Nordic skiing. Julie Carrick Dalton has a mystery coming up. And the editors of Vermont Almanac are going to talk about their gorgeous book that they put together on people in Vermont. So without further ado, thank you. Sign up for our newsletter. Check it all out on the website. The link to the book is in the chat, and it's also on the website. And we're done for this evening. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
It was good.